So let's get started. I want to talk a little bit about standards of professional practice, and to kind of kick it off, what are the sources of the rules that guide us as notary publics? The first source is state laws. And if you're in a state also that has adopted administrative rules and regulations, those also are law. And so that's the first source. The second source is in court cases. And there aren't always that many cases that come down that affect notaries, but there have been a few, and they have been important. How many of you are California notaries? Okay, a few of you. We just had an appellate court case decision come down earlier this year. We have a statute that says when you identify a signer, you are to use one of these specified identification documents. Among them is a California driver's license. Well, this court case dealt with a couple of notary signing agents who identified a signer for about a $4 or $5 million property in Beverly Hills. The person was an imposter, and the case was about, did the notary exercise reasonable care in examining that driver's license? And you won't find that in the statute, but the court case dealt with it, and because it's a published opinion at the appellate level, it is the force of law now for California notaries. It's an example of how a court decision can be a source of rules for notaries. The third source of rules for notaries are commissioning official guidance. And what I mean by this is all of you have a commissioning official. It's probably the Secretary of State in most of your states. And your Secretary of State may have published, for example, a notary public handbook. Those documents, or maybe FAQs on the commissioning official's website, will also contain official guidance that you should follow when you notarize documents. So that's a third source. Finally, we have what we're going to talk about today, standards of professional practice. So what is a standard of professional practice? Well, we have a definition of that in the code. Our normal way of distributing the code is by PDF on our website. It's free to download. And the term is defined as follows. Standard of professional practice and practice standards mean the minimum acceptable principles, practices, and conduct expected of a notary public that are widely recognized as effective in ensuring the integrity, reliability, and security of notarial acts. Secondly, they are recognized standards. I've gained widespread acceptance in the notary community. An example, keeping a journal. Now, most of you might be in a state that has a journal statute, but there's more than half of the states that don't require notaries to keep a journal in their statute, but it's a recognized standard of practice. And then thirdly, they're proven standards for ensuring the integrity, reliability, and security of notarial acts. They're proven standards. They've been proven to be effective in protecting document signers, their transactions, and even notaries. For example, we know from our notary bonds and insurance program at the NNA that notaries who have been sued, and their E&O policy is being defended. If that goes to trial, we know from history that if a notary keeps a meticulous journal, the court usually views them much more favorably than someone who does not, because it shows that the notary cares. And so it's proven to protect notaries. So these standards are minimum, they are recognized, they are proven, and one more, they are unifying standards. If you're a notary in Vermont or Florida or Montana or in Arkansas, if you all follow the code standards, you're going to get the same level of service. And so we're unifying everybody around a common body of standards. Now, 3 points. Number one, a standard of practice may be found in your state law, but often it is not. For example, a journal. You may have a journal statute, and it might say, here's what you have to record in a journal for each notarial act, But there are even states that require a journal that don't require a journal signature of the signer, but that's a professional practice. So a standard of practice may be found in your law, but it may not be. Secondly, and the second point may surprise you, a statute may not be a standard of professional practice. We have a statute in California that allows an attorney or a real estate agent or an escrow agent or a lender to notarize a document for which they will receive a direct commission. Now, our code doesn't take that view, but it's the law in California. And so they have an example of the code espousing a standard of professional practice that is different from what the statute says. Even though you may have that law in California, we're going to recommend that if you're an attorney, you don't notarize your documents. You have a paralegal do it in your office or a legal assistant or somebody like that. And thirdly, every state has some standards of practice in its laws, but no one state has all of them. Every state falls short in one degree or another, and some states fall shorter than others. The point of that is that a standard of professional practice doesn't have to be a law for you to follow it as a notary, all right? Now, where do you go to find the standards of professional practice? Well, that's where the 2020 Code of Professional Responsibility comes in. It is the most comprehensive and definitive source for notary public professional standards of practice. And so let me introduce for you the code and explain how you can navigate it. We at the NNA want the code to be the field guide for notaries, okay? And if it's going to be the field guide that you use in practice, you have to be able to understand it. And in order to understand it, it's got to be readable and accessible. And so we worked really hard to do that. And then finally, we did one other thing. You know, when we released the 1998 code, that was in a day and age when electronic signatures were just starting. And so by and large, the 1998 code was meant for paper-based notarial acts. But in the 20-some years since, we've had in-person electronic notarization come on the scene, and most recently, remote online notarization. And so we wanted to clarify that the code applies to any notarial act you perform, whether it's paper-based, in-person, electronic, or remote. Let me briefly explain how the code is organized, what the format is, okay? Turn to page 1. You'll see there 10 guiding principles. The 10 guiding principles are the highest level principles of responsible conduct for notaries. If you turn on in your book to page 21, that's guiding principle 3. A notary shall require the appearance of each principal and witness identifying the principal, if any, in order to screen each for identity, willingness, and mental competence. So that's one of the 10 guiding principles. But then under the guiding principles, we have, throughout this code, 90 standards of professional practice. The specific 90 that we cover in the code are organized under these 10 guiding principles. On average, about 9 per chapter. Some have more, some have less. So the first standard under guiding principle, read there on page 21, is 3A1. It says physical appearance. It reads, the notary shall require each principal and witness identifying a principal, if any, to be present physically before the notary at the time of notarization unless law in the notary's state of commissioning expressly authorizes otherwise. For each standard, we have an illustration that helps you visualize this particular principle. And so you'll see the illustration under the standard I just read on page 21. A client has just signed and mailed several documents for the notary to notarize. On a phone call, the client says, you know my signature, so there shouldn't be any problem with you notarizing my documents without me being there. All right? It does happen. And so that's the illustration here. We don't just stop with the illustration. We provide a resolution for each illustration that applies the standard of professional practice to that illustration. And so that the resolution for that illustration I just read, the notary declines to perform a notarization over the phone without the principal appearing before the notary, since it would be a clear violation of the law and this Notary Public Code of Professional Responsibility. One more very briefly. If you turn to page 25. At the end of each guiding principle, each chapter, in this case chapter 3, you'll see we have a commentary section, legal commentary to provide an explanation of the standards under that guiding principle. So if you want to read more about the thought behind it and the rationale for why we did it, you can read about it there. Okay, so that's what the code is and how you can get around in it.